Adam 8 presents one of the most incredible artists of our time, John Lennon, singing 15 of the great rock and roll hits, never before available anywhere. Yes, you get 15 great hits in one fabulous record album for just $4.98. Hear John Lennon sing Ain't That a Shame. Slippin' and a slidin'. Do you want to dance? That's right. Only $4.98 for this new and priceless collection of John Lennon singing 15 great rock and roll hits. Hear John Lennon's version of Peggy Sue, Boney Maroney, Angel Baby, Ya-Ya. Hear these never-before-available John Lennon performances of such rock and roll hits as Sweet Little 16, Stand By Me, Just Because, You Can't Catch Me, Bring It On Home, Rip It Up, and the fabulous Bebop-A-Lula. Yes, John Lennon sings 15 great rock and roll hits, all in one fantastic album for just $4.98 or $5.98 for 8-track tape. Here's how to order.
Hi, I'm Denny Somack, and this is The Rock Podcast. Now, I always try and bring you unique stories, and we have a good one for you on this episode. It involves John Lennon, his lawyer, and a mobster, and it surrounds Lennon's classic album of oldies, the Rock and Roll album. It's a story you may have heard about back in the mid-'70s, but you probably haven't heard many of the details. So let me give you the background. Now, this episode started with a TV ad that ran for less than a week in January 1975, before Lennon and Capital EMI pulled it off the market. Lennon then rush released his official version in February 1975. But today's story actually began in 1969. John Lennon had composed the song Come Together for the album Abbey Road. It was inspired by the Chuck Berry tune You Can't Catch Me. Melodically, it resembled the original, and John took the third line of the second verse, Here Come Old Flat Top, for his new lyric. The publisher of Chuck Berry's music was a mobster named Morris Levy, a founding partner of the Birdland Jazz Club in New York, owner of the Strawberries chain of record stores, co-founder and owner of Roulette Records, whose most famous artist was Tommy James and the Shondells. He was described by Billboard magazine as one of the record industry's most controversial and flamboyant players. Okay? So, while all this was going on, John Lennon had split with Yoko and was living in Los Angeles with his personal assistant, May Pang. Most of you know that story. He didn't want to return to New York for the court case, so he agreed to record at least 3 songs from Levy's publishing catalog on his next album. This is right after Mind Games. And Levy dropped the suit. Now, as John was looking at Levy's catalog, he found a number of his favorite songs, so he decided to do a full album of cover songs, and this became the Rock and Roll album. Lennon initially teamed up with producer Phil Spector to record the album. I'll let John explain.
Well, it's a rock and roll album by the title, and none of which I wrote. It's all, you might call it oldies but goldies. I was calling it oldies but moldies when I was making it. And some of them are, quite a lot of them are cuts I was singing when I was 15. That's around 1955. Some of them are the first songs I ever learnt that were rock and roll, ever learnt to play on a guitar. I even started on banjo originally. And they're some of my all-time favorites. There's about 14 of them on the album. I could have gone on forever. I had to stop. The album was in 2 phases, as it were. It was started in 73, actually, when it was a brand new idea. Right? There's been a lot of oldies but goldies since then. I started with Phil Spector, and the tracks that I did with him, he produced. I just wanted to be a singer. And to put it simply, there was some psychodrama, and it sort of fell apart. And then there was a long spell where, for one reason or another, I couldn't get hold of the tapes. And then I did Walls and Bridges. And then I got the tapes the day before I was going in to do Walls and Bridges. So I did Walls and Bridges, and then I started sorting through the tapes I'd done with Phil. I chose the ones that I thought were good enough, because some of them are a bit weird, you know. And and then I went back in the studio after a few weeks rest from Walls and Bridges, and cut enough to make a full album of material, and here it is, you know.
This pissed off Levy, and he threatened to refile his lawsuit. Lennon assured Levy that the Covers album was in the works. As a sign of good faith, Lennon gave Levy a rough copy of the tracks to review, and Levy offered to directly market the album via television mail order, all through his own Atomate Limited record label, bypassing Capitol and EMI. Claiming he had an oral agreement with John Lennon, Morris Levy pressed an album from the rough tape Lennon had provided, then proceeded to sue Lennon, EMI, and Capitol for $42 million for breach of contract. John finished work on his version of the album, and in February 1975, Capitol Rush released the official rock and roll album that we know today. At the same time, John reconciled with Yoko. The case was heard in New York District Court, and our guest is Jay Bergen, a trial lawyer in New York City for 45 years. He's handled antitrust cases, entertainment-related copyright cases. He also represented Albert Grossman, Bob Dylan's first manager, and Terry Knight, a manager of Grand Funk Railroad, in his litigation against the band, and also represented the late George M. Steinbrenner, of course, the legendary, colorful owner of the Yankees. But that has nothing to do with today's story. Jay has just released a new book, Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer, The Untold Story, where he shares his experiences as John Lennon's attorney and friend. I think you'll find this conversation with Jay of great interest, since it's got the courtroom drama that unfolded and John Lennon's testimony in which he outlined his creative process for the judge. So here's our conversation with Jay Bergen. Let's talk about this book. It's interesting. So first of all, let me just start. Give me a little of your background. I know you were a trial attorney, but just for the audience, just give us a little background.
Originally from Long Island, practiced in New York City for 45 years as a trial lawyer. Retired, moved to North Carolina after a couple of years, lived in Brooklyn Heights for a long time, and went to Fordham College, Fordham Law School. And I clerked for the Chief Judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York in 1962, Honorable Sylvester Ryan. And I've been a litigator and a trial lawyer throughout my my career. Had a brief sojourn where I left New York and got a job with a law firm in the Virgin Islands. That lasted about a year and a half, and I realized I should have stayed in New York, so I came back and stayed there for the rest of my career.
Okay, so we're going to get into this case. The case we're talking about is the John Lennon rock and roll album case, which has gotten a lot of publicity over the years, but now you've sort of put everything together in a book as you were the trial attorney assigned to the case. So just for our listeners, and actually for myself too, because I know why this case came about, but it is all contingent on the original Levy Lennon versus Beatles come together. Could you give me the background on that case and what happened that led us to this point?
Sure. Levy, who was notorious for bringing these copyright infringement cases, filed this case in 1970 against the Beatles publishing companies. He claimed that Come Together, which was written by John, and that's why John kind of assumed the responsibility infringed the copyright of You Can't Catch Me, the Chuck Berry hit. By the time the case was almost ready for trial in October of 1973, not much had happened during those 3 years. John was in Los Angeles and had just started recording what he called his Oldies but Goldies album with Phil Spector producing. All the classic rock songs from the 50s and 60s. Of course, when he was notified that the case was going to come to trial, John said, "You can't bother me. I'm working. We've got to settle the case somehow." And the settlement was, instead of a payment of money, Levy kind of got his clutches on John by extracting the settlement of where John, on the next album, which was the Goldies, the Oldie But Goldies album, he was supposed to record 3 songs owned by Morris Levy, one of which had to be You Can't Catch Me. Phil Spector, unknown to John, was taking the master tapes home every night, and then Phil disappeared. And they didn't get the tapes back until the summer of 1974, by which time John was ready to start recording his album, Walls and Bridges. When Walls and Bridges came out, Morris Levy started jumping up and down screaming, "Where are my 3 songs?" Now, Morris knew that they would not be on Walls and Bridges because they were all John's original compositions, except for a little joke cut at the end with John singing "Ya Ya," the Lee Dorsey hit, and Julian, his son, banging away on the drums. That led to a meeting in October of 1974, where the result of which was that Levy claimed that John made an oral agreement during that meeting to permit Levy to market the rock and roll album on TV on a worldwide basis. Nothing was in writing. And when John finally, did the basic recording for the album, Levy kept harassing him and asking him, "Where are my songs? Where are my songs?" And John finally, mistakenly also, gave him a rough mix of the unfinished album, a reel-to-reel 7.5 IPS tapes. When John and his advisors told Levy in January of 75 that Capitol did not want to sell the album on TV, Levy started making noises to release it himself and start advertising it, where you'd send in your $4.98 and they'd send it to you in the mail. That's when I got involved. My senior partner, David Dalgenis, who had been hired by John, Ringo, and George to advise them on the dissolution of the Beatles partnership, asked me to go to a meeting at Capitol Records on February 3rd, 1975. I went to the meeting, talking to Capitol lawyers, when suddenly the door to the conference room opened and John Lennon walked in. And I did not know he was going to be at the meeting. I don't know whether the Capitol lawyers did, but the result of that meeting, Denny, was that John would go back into the studio the next day, February 4th, and next 2 days, February 4th and 5th, and finish the album. John decided that he really didn't want to wait any longer. This record had taken more time than any album he had ever recorded. He was really kind of sick of it and wanted to finish it. And that's what he did. And when John and I left the Capitol building that evening about 7 o'clock, we got out on the street. He said, "Good night, I'm going home." And I believe that was the first night that John went back to the Dakota and reunited with Yoko after his lost weekend and their 18-month separation. And it was shortly after that Levy started advertising. We started sending telegrams to the TV station saying this is not the authorized album. Capitol released the official album on February 13th. Morris Levy pulled the record, his ads, having sold, I think, about 1,250 copies, and shortly thereafter sued John and Yoko, John and EMI Capitol Records,
Right.
claiming that he had this oral agreement.
Okay. So let's get into that. But before, I just want you to answer this question. I know you weren't involved, but do you think had Lennon pursued Levy on the Come Together that Levy would have won, or the Beatles would have won?
Well,
I mean, it was one line. Here come old
I
flat top.
know. And the complaint was only 3 pages long, and the complaint focused completely on the one line. I was not involved in the case. I don't know what happened during the case. There wasn't much activity in the case for 3 years, but it was the one line, "Here come old flat top," which Chuck Berry was talking about a convertible that passed him on the Jersey Turnpike one night. John Lennon was talking about here's a man who used to have a flat top and now has long haircut, now has a hair down to his knee.
Okay, so do you think that Lennon being at that first meeting where you first met him, do you think that helped solidify you becoming the lawyer?
Well, I think what really solidified it, although it happened later, because Morris then filed a lawsuit in New York Supreme Court alleging the breach of contract, as I said, alleging tens of millions of dollars in damages. But surprisingly to me, about 2 weeks later, they filed a federal antitrust case in the federal court in New York against the same defendants. That never happened to me in my career, where the same plaintiffs would sue the same defendants in 2 courts. And that, in my opinion, was a fatal mistake, because cases in the New York Supreme Court move very, very slowly. In the federal court, they are assigned immediately to a judge the day they are filed, and they have a very fast calendar and they move very quickly. So after John and Yoko had an opportunity to look at these complaints, John called me one day and asked me to come up to the Dakota to meet Yoko. We spent about an hour talking about the case. She asked me a lot of questions about my background, about the cases, why Morris had filed the 2 cases. And I told him, and I had told John this in telephone conversations, that I believe that Morris was just trying to bully him into a settlement and was thinking that John and Capitol and EMI would kind of cave and give in. John, at that point, was not going to settle. He was not going to cave in. Morris had gotten his clutches on him through the Come Together lawsuit, but he didn't want that to continue. He wanted it to stop. I went up and had this meeting with Yoko, and Denny, it wasn't until I really started working on this book 5 years ago that that was an audition. If Yoko hadn't liked me, I would have been out.
That's absolutely correct. I've been up there a number of times. I know her. I've been in that kitchen. And absolutely, if she had any qualms,
yeah, I would have been out. And I guess I was a little bit naive in the sense that I knew they were very close to each other, but I didn't really grasp at the time that it was an audition. John wasn't in the room. We were sitting in the big living room overlooking Central Park, and we had a very pleasant conversation. She grilled me, but very, very politely. It was obvious she was a very smart woman. She had read the papers, she had read the complaints, and at the end of the meeting, she stood up and she said, "Well, I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk. Thank you for coming. Adios." I left. And after that, I had no contact with her until the trial.
Right. Okay. So let me just fill in some blanks here. So you're what, about 3, 4 years older than John?
A little less than 3.
A little less than 3. Okay. And what
Yeah.
was your awareness of the Beatles? I think you actually saw them, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I did. Well, I was a rock and roller from my high school days in Long Island in the early 50s. I had seen Elvis when I was in college in Philadelphia. And I saw the Beatles at the Forest Hills Tennis Stadium in August of 1964. I had also seen their movie, A Hard Day's Night, and I thought, these guys are the real thing. They were very, very clever. I was a Beatles fan. And so there I was suddenly, representing John Lennon.
You saw him on Ed Sullivan, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I saw them, the great thing about the tennis stadium at Forest Hills was there were only about 16,000 people there.
Right.
So it was a very, very intimate setting.
So up until that time, okay, so you're aware of his music and all that kind of stuff. Now you have the meeting. Tell me your personal, I mean, obviously you're a fan, like anybody, the first time you meet somebody, what went through your head when he actually met face to face?
Well, I was, I was really kind of stunned for a few seconds because I didn't know he was going to be there, but we shook hands, introduced ourselves, and then he just very quickly evolved into a client. I was trying to find out the facts. One of my real strengths as a trial lawyer was I always believed in being prepared, and I always believed in understanding the facts completely. And I explained that to John, and we spent a lot of time going over the facts, and with not only with him, but with May Pang, with Harold Sider, anyone else who was involved. And the facts never changed, Denny. The facts were the same. When we talked at that meeting about the possibility of putting this album on TV, Morris was told over and over again, we have to get EMI's permission. And everybody in the music business knew that the Beatles were exclusively signed to EMI. So Morris was not fooled at all. He didn't, nobody put a con job on him. And John and I developed a relationship. I was the lawyer, he was the client, and we just kind of clicked. And the other thing, Denny, is that this was the time when John dropped out of the music business. He was very chilled out. I think he was very glad to have gotten back with Yoko, and all he wanted to do was just await the birth of their child.
Mm-hmm. Right. It was his house husband days. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And he was. I think he was very happy at that time.
Yeah. So, what initial thoughts did you have of why you thought this had a good chance of winning?
Well, there's no such thing as a slam dunk,
right?
In litigation, in trial work, there's no such thing as a slam dunk when you release an album. Nobody knows what's going to happen. But I believed that the facts were really in our favor. Now, I didn't know anything about Morris Levy. I was just beginning to realize that he was really, he was a gangster. If it wasn't for the fact that he was Jewish, he would have been a made member of the mafia. And the Genovese crime family had really total control of him. Thomas Eberly was one of his secret partners in Roulette Records and some of his other publishing companies. So it isn't that I thought we were going to win. John and Yoko said, look, that more than once, the most important thing, Jay, is we want to hold down the amount of money that John is going to owe Morris. And I kept telling them, if I have anything to say about it, you're not going to owe him any money. and we're going to be prepared and ready when we get to a trial. And since I knew that the federal case would move quicker, we kind of pushed things along that way. And I was just confident that if we were prepared, we would have the better of the deal. I remember once I said to John before he testified at his deposition in May of 1975, I said, you know, we've got an advantage here in this case as we were going over the facts. And he said, what's the advantage? I said, you're going to be telling the truth. Morris is not going to be telling the truth, because the truth would cause him to lose the case.
Right. Okay. So John felt good that you felt good that you could win this thing, and nothing's a slam dunk, as you said. Tell me what the 2 or 3, and for those that you really got to read this thing from beginning to end, because you go day by day, witness by witness, and it's great. So tell me the 2 or 3 pivotal witnesses that supported your case.
Well, John, of course, was the pivotal witness. The other pivotal witness that supported our case was Morris Levy.
Explain that one. Because I know I was going to say, I know you're probably going to say Dave Marsh and one of the, you know, the person who described the audio stuff, but you know, this is a good point to talk about Morris Levy. I know who he was. I didn't personally know him, but I'd run into him at industry events. I knew the whole deal with him putting his name on there. I knew the fact he owned Birdland in New York, Strawberries Records chain he owned, and everybody in the industry sort of knew what he was about, but they all tolerated it.
Well, they all tolerated it, I think, because a lot of them were afraid of him. You know, but anyhow, let me get back to the.
Before you do, did you ever read Tommy James's book?
Yes, I did.
Okay, fine. Enough said. Go ahead.
I did.
Okay.
That was one of the first things I did when I started thinking about writing the book. But the key here was that Morris Levy hired William Shertman to be his lead lawyer. William Shertman did not participate in any of the pretrial proceedings except for 2 pretrial conferences before Judge McMahon. I knew Judge McMahon. I knew of him in the courthouse. He was 16 years on the bench. He tolerated no monkey business in the courtroom by lawyers or their clients. And instead of handling the case, Shertman turned it over to one of his younger partners, a young lawyer named Alan Kanzer. Alan Kanzer took the depositions. He took John's deposition, and he defended Morris's deposition. And that, in my opinion, came very close to malpractice, because Bill Shertman should have been taking John's deposition, and he should have been defending Morris's deposition. He should have been handling all of the other depositions. And so by the time we got to the trial, Denny, I was prepared and Bill Shertman wasn't. You can't be the trial lawyer who's going to handle the case and try to catch up at the last minute. And therefore, when I say that Morris Levy was one of our best witnesses, when he started questioning Morris on the first day of the trial before Judge McMahon, Morris was volunteering testimony. He was telling stories. He was not prepared. And that really was extremely damaging. And it got the judge very angry. He kept volunteering testimony. I kept objecting. Your Honor, Mr. Levy is not answering the questions. And the judge lost his patience very quickly. So that was one of the keys to winning the case. We were prepared. John was prepared. Our other witnesses were prepared. May Pang did a terrific job when she testified, because again, the story was the story. And
Was there tension when May was there, and was Yoko there when May was there?
Well, I'll tell you a funny story about that, and it's in the book. But of course, this trial was in the winter, so May came one day, and we didn't get to her, so she had to come back the next day. But when she finished the next day, her testimony, it was near the end of the day, and we were adjourning court, and John came up to me where I was putting my trial material in my suit, my bag, and he whispered to me, Jay, you've got to get May out of court and into the elevator. We can't wind up in the elevator with the two of us, me with Yoko and May. I said, what? I don't understand. He said, please, she's wearing Yoko's coat. I said, what are you talking about? He said, Jay, you've got to get her in the elevator. So I said, okay. I went out into the lobby where we were waiting for the elevators and talking to May and thanking her for her testimony, appreciating her time. And I gradually eased her towards the elevator, and the door opened, in she got, and away she went. I never asked John what's the deal about Yoko's coat. I think it was actually a coat that Yoko, a winter coat that Yoko gave to May.
Okay.
But there was a little tension there.
So she was a good witness.
She was a good witness. Yeah. Again, because she was telling the truth, and Morris's story kept changing.
And tell me about the strength of Dave Marsh's testimony, because you seem to think that was.
Well, that was on the counterclaims, because we and Capital and EMI filed counterclaims, which basically alleged that the Roots album, Morris's kind of pirated version, interfered with the marketing of the Capital album, John Lennon Rock and Roll. It reduced the money that Capital would have made. It reduced John's royalties. And also, Morris did not have any written permission from John to use his name or likeness or his performances. So that's the part of the trial where John gave some wonderful testimony about how he and the Beatles gradually took control of the whole process, from writing the songs, how they were going to play the songs, and the album covers. And as you know, Denny, probably better than anybody, the Beatles really turned album covers into an art form.
Right.
Dave's testimony that's why we had John testified. We used a lot of the Beatles albums and John Lennon albums as evidence in court. We actually brought in equipment from the record plant and played some of the records. And Dave's testimony was critical, because the judge told us when we got to the counterclaim part, he said, look, and I don't think I explained that we had this mistrial, and the judge in the first case, we wound up with no judge and a new judge being appointed. And the new judge was Thomas Grisey, who was a harpsichordist and a pianist in an amateur classical music group. And he told us the first day we met with him, I don't know anything about this music, but I am a listener. So if you expect me to award damages on the counterclaims, you are going to have to explain to me why there is this conflict between the Roots album and the John Lennon album. So John explained a lot of that in terms of the way he recorded albums, and that this Roots album could not be a top album because it was a 7.5 IPS rough mix. So the part with Dave Marsh was I gave Dave Marsh a copy of each of the albums, and I asked him to listen to them, and then we'd sit down and talk about him possibly testifying. The next day, he sent me a 2-page, almost a 3-page letter, which is on my website, as a matter of fact, John Lennon, Lennon, the Mobster and the Lawyer.com, comparing the two albums and really doing a devastating job of the damage that the Roots album would create because it was so shoddy. The cover was shoddy. There were tracks on the album that John took off, Angel Baby and Be My Baby, because they were so terrible. They were recorded in Los Angeles when there was a lot of drinking and carousing in the studio. And Dave's testimony was the other critical part of the counterclaims, along with John.
So at the end of the day, you win in the counterclaim. And I'm not sure I followed why Morris still got a small amount.
Well, first of all, when we won the first part of the case, where the judge threw out Morris's counterclaims, he basically said that Mr. Levy has trouble even explaining what the terms were of the contract. That proves that there wasn't a contract, among other things. Then we went to the counterclaims, and he awarded a total of like over $400,000 to both Capitol, EMI, and John. Capitol and EMI settled the case behind my back. They approached Levy and Schertman, and Schertman would not settle, did not want to involve us in the settlement. I found this all about later. They settled for $200,000. That meant that we were stuck defending the entire appeal. The $6,000 that Morris got were after we resolved these other two claims. We agreed to settle a claim. We agreed to try the claim that Morris claimed, well, since my songs weren't on the album, I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in publishing royalties. And I was able to show, with the witnesses I put on that aspect of it, that Morris wouldn't have resulted in hundreds of thousands of dollars of publishing royalties, and he only got $6,795. So John's damages were reduced by the Court of Appeals, but he still wound up with $86,000 or $87,000, and then Morris got $6,700.
Why did the Court of Appeals reduce the judgment?
There were some things that they found that the judge the trial judge had made a mistake on. I think one of the principal points was that the judge, in deciding how many albums rock and roll would have sold, but for the interference of the Roots album in the marketing and confusion, the public confusion, he used the Canadian sales. And the Court of Appeals found that the use of the Canadian sales to arrive at the number of albums that he said it would have sold, I think it sold 345,000. He found that it would have sold, I think, at least another 100,000. That's why the Court of Appeals reduced the damages in terms of the royalties to John.
Okay. So after the case is over, are you in touch with John? Do you see him again or talk to him again?
No,
Okay.
I didn't. There was, when the case was over, Levy was forced to turn over to us whatever Roots records he hadn't sold, and also the old 8-tracks. Those were in the days of the 8-tracks.
Right.
And I called Yoko one day. I called the apartment and spoke to Yoko, and I said, look, I've got these albums. I've got a couple of boxes of albums that are now John's. And she said, well, you're going to give them to us? I said, yeah, I'd like to keep a couple for myself as souvenirs. And also I'd like to give one to Jesse Ed Davis and another one to Eddie Motto, who testified. But other than that, yeah, I'll bring them up. So I brought them up. Also, that's when we exchanged the checks and everything, and I gave them the money from Morris, because when Morris appealed, he had to put up a bond in order to pay the damages. So we were assured of getting the full amount of whatever the Court of Appeals finally awarded. And I gave her the boxes of the records, and that was it.
Okay.
You know, John, at that point, let's see, Sean would have been, that was February, March 1977. So Sean would have been about a year and a half old, and John was really into taking care of him.
Now, you did run into Yoko later, right? At the record plant?
Yes. I had a client, Eve Moon, who I had negotiated her deal with Capitol Records. This was in December of 1980. She was recording at the record plant. I, at that point, was representing the record plant. I lived out in New Jersey, so I stopped there at the record plant to just say hello to Eve. And when I walked in, I was surprised to see Yoko sitting in the reception area. I walked over and said hello to her, and she said to me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I have this client who's recording in Studio A, Eve Moon, and this is her first album." And I said, I asked how John was. Spent some time with Eve, and then I left. And I've always regretted not asking what studio John was in. I'm sure he would have been glad to see me. I could have said hello and wished him luck on the album and the new album that they had out at that time, Double Fantasy. But I didn't. So, you know, I didn't see him again. And five nights later, he was killed.
So did the fact that you handled this case get you other entertainment law clients?
I tried after that, Denny.
Well, it sounds like you got Capitol, you got the record plant, you got
Yeah, I got
came with a pretty good recommendation. So
yes, I did. But you know, as you know, from your experience, the competition in New York for lawyers representing artists, singers, and songwriters was pretty fierce. I did represent Till Tuesday with Amy Mann. I had a band from Boston, Face to Face. Jimmy Iovine produced their first album. But I got kind of sidetracked into, you know, other things and other pieces of litigation, and that didn't really become a full-time practice for me.
So are you fully retired?
Yes, yeah, I retired about 10 years ago.
And why did you wait so long to start the book?
I don't know. I carried around with me through 5 or 6 moves, 5 boxes, banker's boxes of the entire file, thousands and thousands of pages, the exhibits, deposition, everything. And it was after we were here in North Carolina that I started thinking about them. And I had never looked in the boxes through that entire time. This is the only case that I had that I have been involved in where I kept the files when I retired. I don't know whether it was, you know, a connection with John, having all of these the records and everything, and the transcript of the trial. But I went out to the garage where we had them in a storage room, and I was thinking about, well, maybe I'll donate them to the Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I sat down on one of the boxes and started reading John's testimony. And then I thought to myself, there's a story here, and there's a story that's got to be told that wasn't told and hasn't been told. There have been bits and pieces in the press and over the years about this case, but frankly, Denny, nobody's gotten it right.
I want to ask you something. Was there press on a day-to-day basis during the trial?
No,
Nobody did it. Was it a closed session or nobody knew it was really
No.
going on?
no, I don't know why. There were, I think Chet Flippo wrote an article right in the beginning from Rolling Stone. John had dropped out by now. He'd been into that husband thing for over a year. And it was interesting because that was the beginning of the period where you had to go through the monitors, to check that you didn't have any bombs with you or something. And so, but we were in and out of the courtroom every day. And I guess I forgot to mention that John and Yoko came to every day of the trial for 20 days, spread over January. And we had about a month off. We went back for the counterclaims in March, April. And I think that was another key to this case, Denny, because I think that sent a message to Judge Grisey that the two of them were really interested, particularly John, that he was there every day, and he was there days when he didn't have to testify. Morris wasn't there all the time. Morris bailed out pretty early. So the more I read of his testimony, the more I realized that I was really the only one now, when I started writing this book in 1970 and 2017, 2017, that could tell the accurate story because I was there. And I also knew who John Lennon was at that time.
Well, you tell a great story. The book is excellent. I recommend it to Beatle fans. It's the one you always like to say. I mean, somebody once told me years ago, and I have a couple of Beatles books out myself.
I know
somebody once told me a few years back, there's three things in the world you can never have enough books on: Marilyn Monroe, the Titanic, and the Beatles. And to this day, I'm convinced that that's correct.
I think you're right, because I mean, look.
I think it was Philip Norman that told me that, who wrote that biography on the Beatles.
Yes. Yeah.
Let me thank you for being a great guest. I wish you a lot of luck with this book.
Thank you. I
For
appreciate
Beatle fans, it's a must. I know it's really goes deep into the weeds, and it's not like for the casual, but it's for the hardcore John Lennon. It's for legal eagles. Fantastic.
Well, great talking to you.
Great talking to you, and good luck with the book. So that's our conversation with attorney Jay Bergen, who has put out his story in the new book, Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer, The Untold Story. Please keep in touch. Go to the website if you have any comments, therockpodcast.com. You can find me on Facebook, and you can send me an email at hello@therockpodcast.com. That's it for now. So long.